Charles Davidson had always lived a life of comfort and success. As a millionaire businessman, he often flew around the world for meetings and to close important deals. He was used to the luxury that came with his wealth, from the first-class cabins to the top-tier service that always accompanied him wherever he went. On this particular flight, Charles was heading home after a week of hard work. He had just secured a big deal, and as he settled into his plush seat on the plane, he couldn't help but feel a sense of satisfaction. The first-class cabin was quiet, the kind of peaceful atmosphere he enjoyed after a long day of meetings. Charles had always been courteous to the staff on planes. After all, he knew how hard they worked to make passengers comfortable, and he had no reason to expect anything less than excellent service. He glanced at the flight attendants as they moved gracefully up and down the aisle, serving drinks and snacks with a professional smile. One of the attendants, a young woman named Rebecca, caught his eye. She was efficient and polite, but there was something about her demeanor that struck him as a little off. She was polite enough, but there was a coolness in her smile that seemed unusual for someone in her line of work. As the plane continued its journey, Rebecca approached Charles' seat to offer him a drink. He was feeling a bit parched after the long flight, so he politely accepted a glass of water. "Thank you," Charles said with a warm smile as he reached for the drink. Rebecca handed it to him without saying a word, her expression neutral, almost distant. Charles couldn't shake the feeling that something was different about the interaction. Normally, flight attendants made small talk, asked how passengers were doing, or gave a few friendly words, but not Rebecca. She handed him the drink, and without another glance, moved on to the next passenger. Charles shrugged it off, not thinking much of it. After all, maybe she was just busy, or perhaps she was having a long day. He leaned back in his seat, thinking about the business deals he had just closed and how he was looking forward to seeing his family. He was a man who enjoyed the fruits of his hard work, and nothing was going to spoil his mood. But just a short while later, as the flight continued, something unexpected happened. Charles had dozed off, his head resting against the window, when he was suddenly startled by the sound of a loud slap. The force of the slap made his face sting, and he immediately sat up, shocked and confused. He looked around, not quite sure what had just happened, and then realized that the slap had come from Rebecca. The flight attendant was standing in front of him, her eyes filled with anger. "Do you know who you just slapped?" Charles asked, his voice a mix of disbelief and rising frustration. It was a question that would lead to a confrontation that neither of them expected. What had started as a routine flight was quickly turning into something much more dramatic. Neither Charles nor Rebecca had any idea that this moment would change the course of their journey, and the events that followed would have a lasting impact on both their lives. Charles was still in shock after the slap. His face stung from the sudden impact, and he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. He looked up at Rebecca, trying to understand what had triggered such an extreme reaction. The flight attendants around them had paused, sensing the tension in the air, but no one seemed to know what to do. Rebecca stood there, her arms crossed, her eyes fixed on Charles. Her expression was cold, almost challenging, as if daring him to say something. Charles, however, wasn't one to back down from a confrontation, especially when he was in the right. He had no idea why this had happened, but he knew that something needed to be said. "Why did you slap me?" Charles asked, his voice firm but controlled. He was taken aback by the situation but determined to get to the bottom of it. Rebecca didn't answer right away. She seemed to hesitate for a moment, her eyes flicking around the cabin, perhaps noticing the attention they were beginning to attract. She finally spoke, her voice tight with anger. "You think you can just treat people however you want because you're rich?" she asked, her tone bitter. "You act like you're better than everyone else, like your money gives you the right to do whatever you want." Charles was taken aback by her words. He hadn't done anything to provoke this kind of response. He had been polite, as always, and had treated her with respect. He tried to process what she was saying, but it didn't make sense. "I'm sorry, but I don't understand," he replied, his voice calm but confused. I haven't done anything to deserve this. I've always treated people with respect. I don't see why you would slap me over a simple drink. Rebecca's eyes narrowed, and she took a step closer to him. It's not just about the drink, she said, her voice low. It's about the way people like you think they can get away with anything. You think you can walk through life without any consequences just because you have money. Charles felt a knot tighten in his stomach. He could feel the tension rising, and he realized that this wasn't just about him and Rebecca. It was about something much deeper. He had worked hard for everything he had, and while he knew that his wealth could sometimes make people view him differently, he never imagined it would lead to something like this. I'm sorry you feel that way, Charles said, trying to stay calm. But you're wrong about me. I've spent my life working to make a difference, not to act superior to others. I don't deserve to be treated this way. Rebecca didn't seem to listen to him. Instead, she turned away, walking down the aisle without another word. Charles was left sitting in his seat, still processing what had just happened. His face still stung from the slap, but it was the confusion and frustration that lingered. What had he done to provoke such a reaction? He knew he had to do something about it, but he wasn't sure what that something was just yet. As the plane continued on its journey, Charles couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. This unexpected encounter had shaken him, but he was determined to understand why Rebecca had acted the way she did. Little did he know, the situation would escalate further, and the truth behind Rebecca's anger would soon come to light in ways he never imagined. Charles sat in his seat, still stunned by the sudden slap. The plane was now cruising comfortably at 30,000 feet, but Charles felt far from relaxed. He couldn't shake off what had just happened. Rebecca's words echoed in his mind. You think you're better than everyone else because you're rich. But he knew that wasn't who he was. He had worked hard for everything he had, and he didn't see himself as above anyone. Yet here he was, facing an accusation that seemed completely unfounded. He sat back, trying to calm himself. The last thing he wanted was to escalate the situation further, especially on a plane full of passengers who were now watching the exchange unfold. Charles took a deep breath, hoping to regain his composure. But something inside him also told him that this wasn't over yet. He couldn't just let this go without understanding why it happened. Charles decided to approach the situation carefully. He didn't want to make a scene, but he knew he needed answers. He pressed the button to call for a flight attendant. Moments later, another member of the crew appeared at his seat. It was a man this time, and he was clearly aware of the tension between Charles and Rebecca. Is everything all right, sir? The flight attendant asked politely. Charles could tell the man was trying to maintain professionalism, but there was a sense of discomfort in the air. I need to speak to Rebecca, Charles said, keeping his voice calm. Can you ask her to come to my seat? The attendant nodded, but before he could leave, Charles added, Please, I'd like to understand what just happened. I didn't do anything to deserve that. The flight attendant looked around and then lowered his voice. I can't speak for Rebecca, but I'll ask her to come by. With that, he walked away to find her. As the minutes ticked by, Charles's mind raced. He kept replaying the moment in his head, wondering if there was something he had missed. Was there something about the way he had acted that had made Rebecca feel so angry? He had no idea. Soon, Rebecca appeared again, standing by the side of his seat. She looked tense, her arms crossed, and her eyes avoiding his. Charles stood up, making sure his posture remained respectful and non-confrontational. Rebecca, can we talk? He asked gently. She hesitated for a moment before nodding. Fine, she said, though her voice was still filled with some hesitation. Look, I know something happened earlier, and I don't want to make this worse, but I don't understand what caused it, Charles said. I've always treated people with respect. So why did you slap me? Rebecca took a deep breath, clearly conflicted. She glanced around the cabin, making sure no one else was listening too closely. It's not just you, she started slowly. It's the way people like you, people with money, act like they can do whatever they want. I've seen it before, over and over. You're all the same. Her voice, though still filled with some anger, seemed to soften slightly as she spoke. Charles listened intently, trying to remain calm. Rebecca, I'm not the same as what you've seen before, he said, trying to explain himself. I've worked my entire life to build what I have. I'm not here to make anyone feel less than me. I just wanted to be treated like everyone else. Rebecca looked at him for a long moment, her expression hard to read. Finally, she sighed, her shoulders relaxing a little. Maybe I overreacted, she said, her tone shifting. It's just, sometimes it feels like people like you don't care about the struggles that others go through. And it gets to me, you know. Charles understood now. It wasn't just about him. It was about the years of frustration that Rebecca had bottled up inside. He realized that, while he hadn't done anything wrong, his wealth and position had inadvertently become a symbol of something much larger in her mind. I'm sorry you feel that way, he said earnestly, but I want you to know that I'm not like that. I see you and everyone else as equals. I didn't mean to upset you. Rebecca's expression softened. Maybe I judged you too quickly, she said quietly. I shouldn't have acted like that. After the conversation, Charles sat back in his seat, still processing what had just happened. The atmosphere on the plane seemed to have lightened, but he couldn't help but think about the exchange he had with Rebecca. It was clear that something deeper had been at play. His wealth and status had unknowingly become a symbol of something Rebecca had struggled with for a long time. He couldn't blame her for her feelings, even if the way she had acted wasn't the right approach. But now, at least, there was a better understanding between them. Rebecca, too, seemed to be processing the conversation. She had walked away with a bit of a lighter step than before. As she continued to serve the other passengers, Charles noticed that she no longer avoided eye contact with him. In fact, a few moments later, she walked down the aisle toward his seat with a much more relaxed demeanor. Hey, Rebecca said, standing in front of him. I just wanted to apologize again for earlier. I know it wasn't right to slap you. Charles looked up, offering a kind smile. No hard feelings. We both said what we needed to say, he replied. Rebecca nodded, clearly relieved. Thanks for understanding. I just have a lot of stuff I've been dealing with. I'm not always the best at handling things in the moment. Charles could relate. Everyone had moments where they reacted out of frustration, especially when they felt misunderstood or judged. I get it, he said. Sometimes it's hard to express what we're really feeling. I think I understand where you were coming from. Rebecca paused for a moment before sitting down beside him, taking a deep breath. I guess I've just had some bad experiences with people who've treated me badly, and it's hard to separate one person from the next. I see people like you, with all your success, and I assume that you don't understand the struggles of people like me. But that's not fair to you. Charles nodded, appreciating her honesty. It's easy to fall into that trap of judging people based on what we see on the outside. I've been lucky enough to have the opportunities I've had, but I've also worked really hard to get here. I've seen my fair share of struggles too. Rebecca looked at him, clearly surprised by his words. I didn't expect you to say that, she said softly. Charles smiled. People like me don't always get the chance to show the real side. I'm more than just my wealth. I care about people, and I think everyone deserves respect. The two sat in silence for a moment, both reflecting on their conversation. Rebecca seemed to have a sense of relief, and Charles felt a new sense of understanding between them. The tension that had once hung in the air was now gone, replaced with an unexpected bond that neither of them could have predicted. When Rebecca got up to leave, she smiled at Charles. Thanks for being understanding, she said, her tone lighter than before. I appreciate you giving me the chance to explain. Charles nodded, feeling grateful that they had reached a place of mutual respect. No problem. We're all learning something new every day. As Rebecca continued her work, Charles leaned back in his seat and closed his eyes for a moment. He realized that this was an important lesson for him too. Sometimes, situations that seem difficult or uncomfortable can lead to unexpected understanding and growth. He had learned that judging others based on assumptions could lead to misunderstandings, and that true change came from taking the time to really listen to one another. The flight had turned out to be far more than just a trip home. It had become a journey of learning and growth for both him and Rebecca. As the hours passed on the flight, Charles began to reflect on the unexpected turn of events. What had started as an ordinary business trip had become a lesson in understanding, empathy, and communication. It was strange how a single moment, a slap, could lead to a conversation that made him realize how often people judged one another based on appearances and assumptions. He thought about Rebecca and how her actions were fueled by deeper feelings of frustration and disappointment. She hadn't just slapped him because of a small misunderstanding. She had been carrying emotional baggage, a weight of anger that had built up over time. And in a way, he realized, she had probably been searching for a way to express her frustration. Rebecca had returned to her duties, but Charles noticed that her interactions with him had shifted. The coldness that had existed between them before had disappeared, replaced with a newfound sense of mutual respect. He watched as she moved down the aisle, serving drinks and chatting with passengers in a much warmer manner. It was clear that the conversation they'd had earlier had made a difference, not just for him but for her too. Charles was glad they had taken the time to talk. It had given him a deeper understanding of why people acted the way they did. As the flight neared its destination, Charles felt a sense of peace settle over him. He had always prided himself on being a fair person, someone who worked hard and treated others with respect. But the encounter with Rebecca had opened his eyes to the reality of how easy it was for people to feel misunderstood. He thought about how often people were judged based on their wealth, appearance, or status, and how that judgment could cause rifts between them. It wasn't just about wealth. It was about people taking the time to listen and understand each other, regardless of their background or circumstances. When the plane began its descent, Charles gathered his things, preparing to leave. He stood up and made his way to the aisle, just as Rebecca was walking toward him. As their paths crossed, she offered him a small smile, and this time it was genuine. "I hope you have a safe and smooth landing," she said, her tone friendly and warm. Charles returned the smile, feeling that in that brief moment, something meaningful had been shared. "Thanks, Rebecca," he replied. "And take care. I hope everything works out for you." Rebecca's eyes softened, and for the first time, Charles saw the sincerity in her expression. "Thanks. I'm really glad we talked," she said. "I'll try to do better next time." As he walked off the plane and into the airport terminal, Charles couldn't help but think about how the situation had unfolded. He had gone into the flight expecting a normal journey, but instead, it had turned into a moment of learning for both him and Rebecca. He realized that it was easy to let misunderstandings fester, but by talking openly and honestly, people could bridge the gaps that separated them. Charles knew that he would remember this encounter for a long time. It wasn't just about the slap. It was about taking a moment to understand the person behind the actions, to see beyond the surface and recognize the deeper emotions at play. And in that small exchange, he had learned a valuable lesson. No one should ever be judged by their appearance or status alone. True understanding came from empathy and open communication. After the flight landed, Charles felt a mix of relief and satisfaction. He had been expecting a routine trip home, but it had turned into an experience that changed his perspective. As he walked through the airport, he couldn't stop thinking about the conversation he'd had with Rebecca. He realized how much he had learned in such a short amount of time. In just one exchange, they had gone from a tense and uncomfortable moment to mutual understanding and respect. Charles knew that many people might have just brushed off the incident and let it go, but he was glad he took the time to address it. He had always prided himself on being fair and understanding, but now he understood just how easy it was for people to jump to conclusions. There was so much more beneath the surface than what one could see at first glance. It wasn't just about wealth or status. It was about the complex emotions and experiences that shaped each person's actions. As Charles made his way through the airport, he thought about Rebecca's earlier words. She had been frustrated with the way people like him were often perceived, people who were wealthy and held a certain status. And while he had never meant to come across as superior, he now understood how his actions could be misinterpreted. He had seen himself as someone who worked hard for what he had, but for some, that success could make him seem distant or unapproachable. But Charles was determined to change that. The conversation with Rebecca had made him realize that it wasn't enough to simply be kind to those around him. He also had to make a conscious effort to show empathy. He had always tried to treat people with respect, but he now understood the importance of going beyond the surface and truly listening to others. It was a lesson he knew would stay with him for the rest of his life. When Charles finally arrived home, he was greeted by his wife, Emily. She smiled warmly as she saw him walk through the door. "How was the trip?" she asked, giving him a quick hug. "It was fine, but something happened that really made me think," Charles replied, still reflecting on the events of the day. Emily raised an eyebrow, curious. "What happened?" Charles sat down and began to tell her about the incident with Rebecca. He explained how a simple misunderstanding had turned into an opportunity for him to learn about the struggles that others face. Emily listened carefully, nodding as he spoke. "I think it was really good that you took the time to talk to her," Emily said after a pause. "Sometimes we just need to take a step back and understand where someone else is coming from. It's easy to assume things, but you showed her kindness, and that's what really matters." Charles smiled at her words, feeling grateful for her understanding. "You're right. It was a good reminder for me that we all have our own stories, and sometimes we just need to listen and be patient." The rest of the evening was peaceful, with Charles reflecting on how one brief encounter had opened his eyes to a deeper level of understanding. He knew that life wasn't always black and white, and he had learned that by taking the time to listen to others, people could connect on a level that went beyond surface-level assumptions. That night, as Charles lay in bed, he made a promise to himself. He would continue to treat others with respect, but he would also take the time to understand their experiences and emotions. He realized that empathy and kindness were the true measures of success, not wealth or status, and he would carry that lesson with him wherever he went. A few days after the flight, Charles couldn't stop thinking about what had happened with Rebecca. He realized how much that brief encounter had changed his perspective. It was easy to get caught up in the world of business and success, but now he understood that people carried with them experiences, struggles, and frustrations that weren't always visible at first glance. He had learned a valuable lesson in empathy and how important it was to truly listen to others, not just assume or judge them based on their outward appearance. Charles found himself reflecting on how he interacted with others, not just during his travels, but in his daily life. In business, he had always tried to maintain professionalism and respect, but now he realized that it wasn't just about being polite. It was about being genuinely considerate of people's feelings. He wanted to be the kind of person who made others feel heard and valued, not just someone who was known for their wealth or position. The next week, as Charles was traveling again for work, he found himself sitting next to someone on the plane who seemed a bit nervous. The woman, probably in her late 30s, was fidgeting with the armrest and glancing around anxiously. Charles noticed that she seemed uncomfortable, and for a moment, he thought about what he had learned from his interaction with Rebecca. Instead of focusing on his own thoughts or retreating into his work, Charles decided to strike up a conversation with the woman. He smiled warmly and asked if she was okay. She hesitated for a moment, but then smiled back, clearly relieved by his approach. "I'm just a bit nervous," she admitted. "I've never flown alone before, and I'm on my way to a job interview. I don't really know what to expect." Charles nodded sympathetically. He remembered how stressful job interviews could be, especially when they felt like they could change the course of your life. "I understand. I've been there too. It's completely normal to feel nervous, but just remember that you've got this. You've prepared, and you're going to do great." The woman smiled, looking a little more at ease. They chatted for the remainder of the flight, and Charles could see her confidence growing with every word. When the plane landed, she thanked him for the conversation and said she felt much more at ease. "You really made me feel like I wasn't alone in this," she said with a grateful smile. As they parted ways, Charles realized just how powerful a simple conversation could be. It didn't take much to offer someone a little comfort or encouragement. All it took was being present and showing kindness. It reminded him of the lesson he had learned from Rebecca and how it wasn't about wealth or status. It was about how we treat others, especially in moments when they need support the most. Back at home, Charles shared the story with his wife, Emily. "I really feel like I'm starting to understand people more, not just in business, but in everyday life," he said. "It's all about connecting with others on a deeper level." Emily smiled, proud of the change she saw in her husband. "You've always been a good person, Charles. But I'm glad to see that you're learning even more about what truly matters." Charles nodded. He knew the journey wasn't over, but he felt that he was on the right path. He had learned something invaluable that day, and it was something he would carry with him in all his interactions going forward. By listening, being patient, and showing kindness, he could make the world around him a better place, one small interaction at a time.